Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading Flying Against Time with Chapter 2. Ferdinand sipped startled violently as Ted accepted his challenge. That start told volumes. Ted perceived at once that Sip had not expected he would be taken up. He had purposely made the conditions so hard that he thought Ted would falter. For some reason, the man had taken a strong antipathy to Ted Scott, and he wanted to humiliate him, and at the same time take Walter Hapworth and Paul Monet down a peg by showing them that their idol had feet of clay. It would have done him a world of good to show that Ted Scott was not as daring as he was supposed to be. Probably, too, the auto mishap of that morning added to the animosity of his little soul. At any rate, he was manifestly discomfited. So much so that a covert smile went around the group as he stared at Ted as though he had not understood him. What was that?" he stammered. "I said I'd take your bet," replied Ted, still smiling. Yes, very well," Sip said, his face red. "You're sure you understand all the conditions?" "I'm perfectly sure," replied Ted. "We'll have them written down right now to prevent any mistake." "I'll make a memorandum of them," volunteered Walter Hapworth, taking a fountain pen from his pocket. He called for a sheet of paper on which he jotted down the precise terms of the wager. He made 2 copies, giving one to Sip and the other to Ted. "Where do we come in?" asked Crown. "Is my 10,000 going begging?" "You come in right here," replied Hapworth. "I'll take that bet." "Look here, Walter," protested Ted. "If you're doing this out of friendship for me—" "I'm doing it partly for that reason, and partly because I think I'm going to win the wager," interrupted Hepworth. "There's 20,000 more that the rest of us have put up," remarked Welby. "Count me in on this," replied Paul Monet. "I'll take every cent of it, and if you want to double it, I'm willing." Ted Scott was deeply touched by the loyalty of his 2 friends. Their prompt stand on his side evidently daunted the others, for there was no willingness shown to accept Monet's offer and double a bet. There were a few readjustments and more scribbling of memoranda. The net result was that $40,000 in bets were made at even money. Of this, 10,000 was an individual bet between Ted and Sip. The other 30,000 offered by Sip's adherents was taken up equally by Walter Hapworth and Paul Monet, who thus stood to win or lose $15,000 apiece. It was agreed that the money should be deposited in the Bromville National Bank to await the result of the race. Shortly afterward, Ted Scott rose to take his leave. Hapworth and Monet accompanied him to the border of the hotel grounds. "I hope I haven't let you fellows in for a beating," said Ted. "It was great of you to back me up the way you did, but I'd feel sore if my failure to win should do you out of $30,000. "Don't you worry about that," interrupted Hapworth. "Any day that I make a hole-in-one is a lucky day for me. I have a hunch that I'm going to win that bet." "You're a man of destiny, Ted. You can't lose," observed Monet. "The harder the job, the more gloriously you'll rise to it." Ted Scott, as he walked away, wished he could feel as certain of victory as his friends seemed to. As an airman, he knew better than they did how stupendous was the task that lay before him, and how many were the chances of failure. If it were simply a matter of courage or skill, he would not have felt worried about the outcome. He was wholly without conceit, but he knew the metal of which he was made. It had been tested too often to leave any doubt about it. But no skill or courage, however great, could baffle adverse circumstances. There were things in this contest that were wholly beyond the aviator's control. The most carefully tested plane might prove defective at a critical moment. The weather was to be reckoned with. A bolt of lightning could hurl him and his plane to the ground. A gale might spring up that no one could fight against. Then, too, there was that sickness or disability clause. Who could guarantee him against illness or broken bones before the date set for the flight? No, it was no child's play that he was attempting. The odds were against him. Ted seldom bet. He did not care to. He might not have done so that day if Ferdinand Sip had not been so insufferably overbearing. Ted had yielded to the desire to wipe that complacent smirk from the man's face. He had done that anyway, he chuckled to himself. It was still a pleasure to think of the consternation on Sip's face when his bluff had been called. Ted did not especially care for the possible loss of his own $10,000. It would not cripple him, as his fame and reputation had already brought him a fortune. Far more keen than the loss of the money would be the chagrin he would feel at failure and the consciousness that he had caused his friends to lose the money they had put up. He was aroused from his musings by the sight of two men approaching. He glanced at them carelessly for a moment. Then his gaze became fixed. He rubbed his eyes. They were... no! Yes! Greg and Dick Gale. Greg and Dick Gale? The bitterest enemies he had on earth. The young men who had robbed and narrowly escaped murdering Eben and Charity. The men who had been convicted and sentenced were supposed to be in prison. While Ted is staring at the approaching jailbirds, it may be well, for the benefit of those who have not read the preceding volumes of this series, to tell who Ted Scott was and what had been his adventures up to the time the story opens. Ted had no memory of his real father and mother. His earliest recollections were of being under the care of James and Miranda Wilson, an elderly couple who had come to Bromville from a town in New England and settled there. They were kind to the little fellow, sent him to school, and did all for him that their slender means permitted. When he was about 10 years old, they had died within a few months of each other, leaving the child to the tender mercies of the world. His forlorn condition attracted the sympathy of Eben and Charity Browning, themselves childless. They had taken the little waif into their hearts and home. Eben Browning was the proprietor of Broomville House, that had once been the leading hotel of the town. He was a genial, kindly man, and his personality won him a large clientage among the anglers who used to come to try their luck in the Rapport River that ran through the place. A change in Eben's fortunes came about when the DeValley Hipson Aero Corporation, engaged in the manufacture of airplanes, established a mammoth plant in Bromville. Along with it came hundreds of workmen and executives, and Bromville began to boom. New hotels sprang up like magic, and old Bromville House, that, in the course of years had grown rather shabby, found its custom slipping away. The crowning blow came when Brewster Gale built the Hotel Excelsior, a hotel that could compare favorably with most of those in large cities. It was a magnificent building with a superb golf course attached that drew tournaments in which golfers from all over the country competed. This was bad enough from Eben's point of view, but what made him writhe in anger was the fact that he had once owned all the ground on which the hotel and golf course were located, and had been swindled out of it by Brewster Gale. As Ted Scott grew older, he did all that he could to help his foster father and mother about the Bromville house. Things brightened up a bit when Ted obtained work in the aeroplant. Ted's work was not drudgery. He loved making airplanes. His secret ambition was to become a flyer, but that seemed for a time to be a hopeless dream. It would take hundreds of dollars to go to a flying school, and he could not lay up a dollar. Besides, he would have to count on the losses of his wages while he was learning to fly. To the plant one morning came Walter Hapworth, a wealthy young businessman and an expert golfer. He was at the time playing in a tournament on the Hotel Excelsior course, in which he owned an interest. Ted was assigned to show Hapworth about the aeroplant. The latter was pleased by the promptness and accuracy which Ted showed in answering his many questions. Learning of the lad's ambitions to become a flyer, he offered to provide the necessary funds to go to flying school, and a sufficient sum besides to make up for his lost wages while away. Shortly after that time, the country was worked up by the offer of a purse of $25,000 to the aviator who should make the first non-stop air flight from New York to Paris. Ted Scott, then in the airmail service, read of the contest and ardently desired to enter it, but he would require a plane and many thousands of dollars for expenses, and he had no such resources. Here again his friend Walter Hapworth came to the rescue. He offered to build the plane and provide all other necessary funds. Ted went out to San Francisco to supervise the building of the plane, which he named the Hapworth after his benefactor. How carefully Ted Scott prepared for the great adventure. How in fog and sleet and storm he flew over the ocean waste, reached Europe, and swooped down like a lone eagle on Paris. It is told in the first volume of this series, entitled Over the Ocean to Paris. Shortly after his return came a great calamity in the Mississippi Valley. One of the greatest floods ever recorded swept over that fertile country. Thousands were rendered homeless by the disaster. Ted Scott enlisted at once in the aviation section of the Red Cross and displayed prodigies of courage in succoring the stricken people. Later on he went back to the mail service, going to the Rocky Mountain Division, the most perilous of all, and had many stirring adventures. Other adventures followed when he crossed the Pacific from California to Honolulu, beating all competitors and establishing an amazing record. Not long afterwards, he made an air flight over the West Indies to rescue imperiled friends, and incidentally recovered a vast amount of treasure and pearls. A little later, he accompanied Walter Hapworth to Mexico, where he helped his friend preserve his oil interests against confiscation. There he came near to ending his career when he fell into the hands of a bandit chief. On his return to America, he was instrumental in rounding up a gang of mail robbers at great personal risk. Once more he flew across the Pacific, this time to faraway Australia, the trip being enlivened by the presence of a madman in the plane. On his return, he was persuaded by Secret Service men to cooperate with them in stopping diamond smuggling from Canada into the United States. How after the most thrilling adventures he succeeded in capturing the king of the smugglers is narrated in the preceding volume of the series, entitled The Lone Eagle of the Border. Now to return to Ted Scott as he views with bewilderment and rapidly rising wrath the approach of the enemies who, he had every reason to think, ought at that moment to be in jail serving the sentences that justice had imposed upon them. There was no love lost between Ted and the Gale twins. They were true sons of their father, Brewster Gale, and had inherited his manifest characteristics. Gregory and Duckworth Gale, Greg and Duck for short, were slightly older than Ted Scott, and had always cherished a bitter hostility towards him for no reason but that Ted was popular in the town, while they were almost universally disliked because of their low characters and dissipated habits. Especially had they been bitter after Ted had achieved worldwide fame by his flight across the Atlantic. They had sought again and again to do him injury, but had always come out at the little end of the horn. The climax had come when they had robbed Eben Browning and clubbed him into unconsciousness. Ted had captured them, and they had been sent to prison. Why were they not in prison now? This was Ted's unspoken question as he watched the pair come nearer. That they also recognized him was evident from the words hastily exchanged between them. Ted, for his part, would have passed them quietly. They were jailbirds outside the pale, but he had no desire to hit anyone who was down. If they really had the desire to fight their way back into decent society, he would be the last one to hinder them. But they would not have him pass. They stopped when within 5 feet of him, and in their eyes was the venom of a rattlesnake. "Ted Scott!" gritted Craig between his teeth. "Gee, how I hate the sight of you!" And that's the end of Chapter 2. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 3, Weaving a Web. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.